Somewhere on an island at the very edge of the time we call prehistory, there may have been people not like us, not quite. Taller, heavier, built on a scale that doesn't fit neatly into any chapter of human evolution we've written so far. And if the evidence is pointing where some researchers think it's pointing, they were still alive just 12,000 years ago. That's not ancient history in the geological sense. That's practically yesterday. The pyramids are only 4,500 years old. Agriculture only goes back about 10,000 years. Whatever these beings were, they may have been walking the earth while the first human civilizations were just beginning to take their first steps somewhere else entirely. Now, before you click away thinking this is about folklore or fringe theory, stay with me because this story sits in genuinely uncomfortable territory for mainstream science. Not the uncomfortable territory of conspiracy, but the uncomfortable territory of real evidence that doesn't have a clean explanation yet. Fossils that don't fit the expected size range. Archaeological signatures that suggest behavior, culture, daily life, oral traditions from the people who lived on and near this island for thousands of years. Traditions that keep describing the same thing across generations. And a scientific community that is actively, sometimes fiercely, divided about what all of it means. That's what makes this worth your full attention. Is not settled. It hasn't been quietly explained away. The debate is live. The evidence is real. And the implications are enormous. Here's why the stakes are so high. Our understanding of human evolution has a kind of timeline. A story we've been telling ourselves with increasing confidence. Modern humans emerged in Africa, spread across the world, and by around 30,000 years ago, we were essentially the last human species standing. The Neanderthals were gone. The Denis had vanished. We were alone. That's the story. Clean, comprehensible, a little. Lonely maybe, but settled. Except it keeps getting interrupted. Homo floresiensis on the island of Flores shattered part of it in 2003. The Denisovans rewrote another chapter, and now there's this. A possible giant human species surviving on an island until an uncomfortably recent date that forces us to ask whether our timeline has another gap in it we haven't fully accounted for. If this turns out to be what some researchers believe it is, then human evolution on islands was doing something far stranger and far more dramatic than we imagined. Not just dwarfism, not just isolated populations shrinking over millennia, but something going in the opposite direction. Something getting bigger, possibly surviving longer, possibly leaving traces we've been misreading, underestimating, or not looking for at all. Over the course of this video, we're going to go through every category of evidence carefully. The fossils and what the measurements actually show, the archaeology, the tools and hearths and the fingerprints of daily life that can tell you whether a species was just surviving or genuinely thriving. The oral traditions which scientists are increasingly taking seriously as repositories of real historical memory, and the scientific disputes because there are smart, credentialed researchers on multiple sides of this, and you deserve to hear all of them. What I'm not going to do is tell you this is definitely real or definitely not, because that's not where the evidence is right now. What I can promise is that we're going to be careful. We're going to separate what's solid from what's speculative, and we're going to sit honestly inside what remains genuinely unexplained, because that's where the most interesting science actually lives. This is one of those stories where the questions are more exciting than any premature answer could be. A giant human species, an island 12,000 years ago. Evidence that keeps surfacing no matter how many times someone tries to close the file. We're going to figure out together how seriously to take it. But before we go any further, I want to know where you are right now. Drop a comment with your location and what time it is where you're listening. I check every single one. It genuinely blows my mind every time I see someone in Tokyo at 2 a.m. and someone in Toronto eating lunch at the exact same moment. Both pulled in by the same question from the distant human past. Now, let's start with what we actually mean when we say giant. The word gets thrown around a lot. Giants, giant humans, a giant species. And every time it appears in a headline or a documentary or a comment section, it means something slightly different, which is most of the problem. So, let's be precise, because precision is the only thing standing between an interesting scientific question and pure mythology. In biological terms, when we talk about human stature, we're dealing with a bell curve. Most modern human populations cluster somewhere between 5 feet 2 inches. and 6'2" with the average shifting based on nutrition, genetics, and geography. The tallest populations on Earth today, certain groups in the Netherlands and among the Dinka of South Sudan, average around 6 feet. That's tall by any measure, but it's population-level tallness. It's the result of selection pressure, diet and genetics working together over generations. Nobody calls the Dutch a giant species. Then you have pathological gigantism. This is a completely different phenomenon. It happens when a tumor or some other dysfunction causes the pituitary gland to overproduce growth hormone. The result is individuals who can reach 7, 8, sometimes 9 foot tall. Robert Wadlow, the tallest verified human in recorded history, stood 8 feet 1 inch. But here's the thing about pathological gigantism. It's a medical condition, not an evolutionary adaptation. People with untreated gigantism suffer. Their joints can't handle the load. Their hearts work too hard. Their bones grow faster than they're supporting. Structures can manage. They don't live long and they almost never reproduce successfully. Pathological gigantism does not produce a species. It produces individuals in pain. So when researchers look at skeletal remains and suggest something as a giant human species, they're not talking about either of those things. They're talking about a third category entirely, a population-level adaptation to large body size, a situation where natural selection over many generations has pushed a group towards significantly greater height and mass as a survival strategy. And this is where anatomy gets genuinely interesting, because size at that scale doesn't just mean being taller. It rewrites the entire engineering spec of a body. Scaling affects everything. Joints that work perfectly at 5 feet 10 inches are under radically different mechanical stress at 7 feet. Bone density has to increase. The architecture of the hip and knee changes. Gait patterns shift because a longer stride requires different musculature and a different center of gravity. You burn more energy just standing still because there's more mass to maintain. Heat loss becomes a serious issue. Larger bodies retain heat better in cold climates, which is why Neanderthals living through Ice Age Europe evolved toward robustness and mass. But in tropical island environments, the calculation flips. Large bodies struggle to shed heat. So if a genuinely large human species was living on an island in a warm climate, that immediately raises a biological question. What selection pressure was driving size upward despite the thermal cost? That's not a reason to dismiss the claim. It's a reason to dig harder. Because if size was being selected for anyway, something in that environment was making it worth the metabolic expense. Now, what would actually count as strong evidence that you're looking at a distinct human species rather than just some tall people? This is where a lot of the confusion in popular coverage collapses. Finding a large femur is not enough. Finding several large femurs is more interesting, but still not enough. What you need is a consistent anatomical pattern across multiple individuals, proportions that hold together as a coherent body plan, features that can't be explained by individual variation or dietary circumstances alone. You need archaeological context, signs of behavior, culture, technology, fire management that suggest a reproducing population living in a place over time, not a handful of outliers. And ideally, you need that pattern to be distinct enough from known species that it can't be folded into existing categories without distorting them beyond recognition. That bar sounds high, and it is. It should be, because the history of paleoanthropology is littered with what happens when the bar gets lowered. Piltdown Man was a hoax that fooled experts for decades precisely because people wanted the evidence to confirm what they already suspected. The field learned hard lessons from that, and those lessons are still active. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and nobody in this conversation should forget that. Here's where most of the confusion in the giant human discourse actually comes from. 3 main sources, and they feed each other in ugly ways. First, mismeasured bones. Fragmentary fossils are notoriously difficult to scale correctly. A partial fore, an isolated skull fragment, a single metatarsal can be assigned almost any height estimate depending on the regression formula you use and the reference population you're comparing against. Small methodological choices produce wildly different numbers, and those numbers then get quoted in media without any of the uncertainty attached. Second, mixed deposits. Caves and rock shelters accumulate material over enormous spans of time. Bones from different periods, different individuals, sometimes even different species end up in the same sediment layer through biotubation, the movement of soil by roots. Animals and water. A large bone from one period mixed with smaller bones from another can look like size variation within a single population when it's actually evidence of sequential occupation by completely different groups. Third, and maybe most corrosive, sensational reporting. The gap between what a research paper actually claims and what a headline declares can be enormous. A paper saying, "These remains suggest unusual skeletal robustness warranting further investigation," becomes, "Scientists discover race of giants before the ink is dry." And once that version is in circulation, it's almost impossible to walk back. The careful version never goes viral. The reckless version lives forever. So when we dig into the specific evidence for what happened on this island, we're going to carry all of that with us. The right framework for what giant actually means biologically. The right bar for what counts as evidence of a distinct species, and the right skepticism about how evidence gets distorted between the excavation site and your screen. Because only with all of that in place can you actually evaluate what's being claimed. And what's being claimed once you see it clearly is strange enough without any embellishment at all. Before we get to the specific island, we need to understand why islands matter to evolutionary biology in a way that continental landscapes simply don't. Because the story we're building toward only makes sense if you understand what islands do to populations over time. They don't just isolate them, they transform them, sometimes in ways that seem to violate everything you thought you knew about how evolution works. Start with the basic mechanics. When sea levels rise, or when a volcanic island pushes up from the ocean floor, or when a land bridge floods and cuts a peninsula loose from a continent, whatever was living there at that moment gets trapped. No gene flow in, no gene flow out. The population that was there becomes the only population. And from that moment forward, evolution stops taking its usual slow, sprawling continental pace and starts doing something much more concentrated and much more strange. This is the field of island biogeography, and it produces some of the most counterintuitive results in all of natural history. The same forces that made the Galapagos finches diverge into a dozen species. The same logic that produced the Komodo dragon and the pygmy mammoth and the dodo also applies to humans, because humans are animals subject to the same selection pressures and genetic drift and resource constraints as everything else. We like to forget that islands have a way of reminding us of the two most dramatic effects have names that sound like they should belong to fairy tales: island dwarfism and island gigantism. And they work in opposite directions depending on what resources are available and what predators are or aren't present. Island dwarfism happens when large-bodied animals get isolated on a small island with limited food resources. The animals that can survive on less, the ones with smaller bodies and lower metabolic demands, are the ones that reproduce. Over generations, the population shrinks, not because anything dramatic is happening, but because being smaller is cheaper. And on a small island with finite calories, cheaper wins. This is how you get dwarf elephants the size of large dogs, dwarf hippos, the Flores Island in Indonesia, which will become very relevant shortly, home to a dwarf elephant species called stegodon that had shrunk to a fraction of its mainland ancestors' size. Island gigantism runs the opposite logic. Small-bodied animals that arrive on an island with abundant resources and no predators can afford to grow. Being bigger has advantages in competition for food, in reproductive success, in thermoregulation. When nothing is hunting you and food is relatively plentiful, size stops being a liability and starts being a dividend. This is how you get giant tortoises, giant rats, birds that lose the ability to fly entirely because the energy cost of flight isn't worth paying when the ground is safe. In evolutionary terms, islands or environments where the usual rules get suspended and new ones get written. Now layer on top of that the question of sea levels and land bridges, because this changes everything about which populations end up isolated, and when sea levels have not been constant over the last million years as ice ages have come, gone. Global sea levels have swung by as much as 400 feet in either direction. During glacial maxima, when enormous volumes of water were locked up in continental ice sheets, vast stretches of continental shelf that are now submerged with dry land. Sunderland, the land mass that connected much of Southeast Asia, was enormous during these periods. Islands that are isolated today were connected to the mainland then, and when the ice retreated and sea levels rose again, those connections flooded. Whatever was living on the newly isolated land masses found itself cut off, sometimes gradually, sometimes with startling speed. This means that the isolation history of any given island is not a simple story. It's a series of connections and disconnections playing out over hundreds of thousands of years. A population might colonize an island during a low sea level period when it was accessible, then get stranded when the seas rose, then potentially reconnect during the next glacial period, then get isolated again. Each cycle is another chapter in the evolutionary divergence story. And some lineages, if they survive long enough through enough of these cycles, can end up looking very different from anything on the mainland. Which brings us to the concept that matters most for what we're about to explore, the relict population. When a species goes extinct on a mainland, it usually goes extinct everywhere. The same pressures, climate shifts, habitat loss, competition from newer species, tend to operate across large connected areas. But islands can be refugia, protected pockets where a lineage that has vanished from the wider world manages to hang on. Sometimes for astonishing lengths of time simply because the pressures that killed it everywhere else haven't arrived yet. The island is a delay, a freeze frame, a place where evolutionary time runs at a different speed than it does on the continents. The Kilanth was thought to have been extinct for 65 million years before one turned up alive in a South African fish market in 1938. The tuatara of New Zealand is a living relic of a reptile lineage that disappeared from the rest of the world 200 million years ago. These aren't anomalies. They're what happens when geography provides shelter. So, when someone proposes that an unusual human lineage survived on a remote island until surprisingly recently, the question isn't whether that's theoretically possible. It is. The mechanisms are well understood. The precedents from other species are extensive. The question is whether the evidence for this particular case is strong enough to take seriously. Late survival in isolation is not extraordinary in principle. What makes it extraordinary is the species involved, the timescale, and what the bones, tools, and sediments actually show. Those are the questions worth asking carefully, and to ask them you first need to know the island. 12,000 years ago is both unimaginably distant and uncomfortably close, if you could step onto the island we're talking about at that moment in time, you would recognize almost nothing in detail, but the outline of the world would feel familiar. There would be shorelines, forests, rivers, rocky headlands, storms rolling in from the sea, the same sun, the same constellations shifted just a little by the slow wobble of Earth's axis. But the map would be wrong, radically wrong, because 12,000 years ago the last ice age was dying. That by itself is a huge statement. It means global. Temperatures were rising fast by geological standards. It means colossal ice sheets that had squatted over North America and northern Eurasia for tens of thousands of years were melting, dumping truly absurd amounts of fresh water into the oceans. And when that much water moves from ice to liquid, coastlines don't just shift politely, they lurch. At the height of the last glacial maximum around 20,000 years ago, sea levels were roughly 120 meters, or nearly 400 feet lower than they are today. By 12,000 years ago they had already begun to climb, but they hadn't finished. Many of the islands we know now weren't islands yet. They were the high ground of broad continental shelves, separated from the mainland not by deep blue water, but by long valleys, river systems, low-lying plains. So when we say a strange, possibly giant human survived on an island until 12,000 years ago, the first question is, what do we even mean by island at that point? Geologically, we're looking at a moving target. The landmass in question might have been connected to surrounding regions 5,000 years earlier, then cut off by rising seas, then partially reconnected by a temporary land bridge, then isolated again. The edge of prehistory, where our story takes place, is not a stable shoreline. It's a drowning landscape. Imagine walking across what is now ocean floor. You'd have river valleys carved into soft sediments, freshwater marshes, patches of grassland, stands of forest. As the sea rose, those valleys would flood first, turning into estuaries, then bays, then inlets. Ridges and hilltops would turn into peninsulas, then archipelagos, then scattered rocky islands. Any people living there would be forced uphill again and again until the last habitable patches of high ground were literally surrounded. From their perspective, the world was shrinking. From ours, the island was being born. Now layer on top of that the living things that mattered to humans, herds of grazing animals migrating across the low plains that are now seafloor, coastal lagoons stuffed with fish and shellfish, seabird colonies on cliffs that are now buried under waves. As sea levels climbed, These resources didn't just disappear, they moved. They reorganized themselves along the new coastlines. If you were a human watching this play out, you had two options. Track the resources as they retreated inland or upslope, or learn to exploit the elongating coastline itself. That meant more fishing, more shellfish, gathering more use of boats or rafts to cross channels that had once been dry land. It meant increased mobility, not just over land but across water. By 12,000 years ago, humans almost everywhere had gotten extremely good at this. We're talking about a world at the tail end of the Pleistocene, sliding into the hole. Big Ice Age mammals still existed in some regions. Mammoths, giant deer, woolly rhinoceros, but many of them were in trouble. Climate change and human hunting pressure were pushing them toward extinction. Smaller, more adaptable animals were thriving. So were humans who could flex with the changes. Technologically, people weren't primitive caricatures. They had specialized stone tools, complex hunting strategies, knowledge of plant foods, control of fire, and in some places early forms of storage and semi-sedentary living. They knew their landscapes intimately. They understood seasonal cycles, animal behavior, tides, and they moved. Human mobility at this point doesn't mean occasional camping trips. It means entire lifeways built on the ability to shift camp quickly to exploit pulses of resources, salmon runs, seasonal fruits, migrating herds, to maintain social links with neighboring bands through journeys that could span dozens or hundreds of kilometers. Boats show up in the archaeological record not just as guesswork, but as unavoidable inferences. People inhabit islands that have never been connected by land during the relevant period. Obsidian from one volcanic source shows up far away. Shell beads travel inland. So place a hypothetical giant people in that world. To say they survived on an island until 12,000 years ago is to tuck them into the very last chapter of the Pleistocene and the very first chapter of what we usually call our time. It also encodes several technical claims that archaeologists and geologists immediately want to unpack. First, the date itself. 12,000 years ago is not a guess like back in the Ice Age. It's a number that implies methods. Radiocarbon dating of charcoal or bone collagen. Optically stimulated luminescence OSL dating of sediments. Uranium series dating of stalagmites or calcite crusts. When someone says survived until 12,000 years ago, they're really saying the youngest reliably dated material we can associate with this population falls around the boundary between the late Pleistocene and early Holocene. That boundary is important because around that time we see dramatic shifts in climate, vegetation, and often in human behavior. In some regions you start to see the very beginnings of plant management that will later become agriculture. In others, you see hunting patterns change as megapora disappear. If a distinct human lineage, giant or otherwise, is still present at 12,000 years ago, it means they coexisted at least briefly with anatomically modern humans equipped with all the post-bottleneck cognitive and social machinery we talked about earlier. That's a big deal. It raises questions about contact, competition, interbreeding, replacement. But before you can argue about any of that, you have to ask the most mundane, most crucial question. Where would the evidence even survive? The late Ice Age world was not kind to archaeological sites along coasts. Rising seas drowned shorelines, chewed away cliffs, rearranged river mouths. If people lived near the ancient coastline, and they almost certainly did because coasts are resawachi, many of their campsites, middens, and kill sites are now under tens of meters of water, invisible without underwater archaeology. What survives best are the places that were either sheltered from these changes or that trapped material in ways water and wind had trouble undoing. Caves are at the top of that list. Limestone or volcanic caves sitting above the highest stand of the post-glacial sea are natural time capsules. Smoke from hearths blacken ceilings. Bones accumulate in dark corners. Tools, beads, broken spear points, and discarded food waste build up in layers of sediment that can stack tens of thousands of years deep. If giant-bodied humans lived on an island, caves could hold their bones, their ash, their tools, and the remains of the animals they hunted. Sinkholes and karst depressions are another. In limestone country, the ground sometimes collapses into vertical shafts or closed basins. Anything that falls in, animals, humans, loose rocks, wind-blown debris, can end up buried and preserved. Many famous human fossils come from exactly this kind of geological trap. On a shrinking island where the ground is fracturing as sea levels fluctuate and groundwater patterns change, Sinkholes are surprisingly common. Then there are river terraces. As climate oscillated and sea levels changed, rivers adjusted their courses and cutting power. They carved new channels, abandoned old ones, left behind stepped platforms of gravel and sand the terraces. If people camped on those stable surfaces by the water, their tools and bones could end up locked into those terrace deposits. Later, when the river cuts deeper, those old surfaces stand above the floodplain like quiet shelves of deep time. Mid-ends, trash heaps essentially, are another kind of archive. Shell mittens on coasts can become prominent mounds rich in food remains, charcoal, broken tools, and sometimes burials. They're perfect for radiocarbon dating because they're full of organic material. They can tell you what people ate, how often they came back to a spot, even what season they visited. If a giant people left a trace of their daily life, it might be in the pattern of shells and bones in a mid-end. All of these potential evidence traps come with the same brutal caveat. The world didn't freeze in place after 12,000 years ago. Erosion keeps working. Rivers migrate, cutting into terrace deposits and washing away anything that wasn't deeply buried. Storms undercut coastal cliffs and collapse cave mouths. Sea level rises don't just drown sites. Wave action can scour them, mixing layers, moving bones and tools far from where they were originally left. Then there's the human factor. Later populations find the same caves attractive, shelter, water nearby, good vantage points. They build hearths on top of older hearths. They dig graves that cut down through earlier layers. They reuse tools, rework bones and trample surfaces. Archaeologists call this later occupation, and it can turn a clean stratigraphic story into a scrambled puzzle. On our hypothetical island, that means any remains of a distinct, possibly giant human lineage would be sitting under and mixed with thousands of years of later human activity. Sorting one from the other is painstaking and uncertain. Bones get broken, moved, burned. Sediment layers slump, rodents burrow. Tree roots drag artifacts up and down through the soil. The clean boundary between their time and our time blurs. So when you hear the phrase, "they survived until 12,000 years ago," understand what that actually entails. It's not a romantic tagline. It's a claim that some fragment of physical reality, bone, charcoal, sediment, shell, has been pulled from this chaotic, shifting, eroding, reoccupied landscape and tied by multiple lines of evidence to that narrow window at the end of the Ice Age. And on this island, in this drowned and rearranged world, a few such fragments did turn up. Not at first in the hands of scientists with careful methods and calibrated instruments, but in the stories of the people who lived there and the chance encounters of outsiders who saw something that didn't fit and couldn't quite let it go. The first discoveries almost never look like discoveries. They look like annoyances, like obstacles. A farmer trying to deepen a well hits something hard that isn't rock. A quarry crew splitting blocks for a pier finds a pale shape in the cut face. A teenager squeezing through a narrow crack in a cliff to impress friends knocks loose a chunk of stalagmite and sees just for a second something that looks disturbingly like a jaw. On this island, as on so many others, the earliest hints of anything strange came in that way as byproducts of people just trying to get on with their lives. Local reports usually precede scientific ones by decades, sometimes centuries. Old men talking about giant bones in a particular cave. A family tradition that the limestone ridge above the village holds the grave of a giant killed in some dimly remembered conflict. Children daring each other to go to the forbidden hole where animals vanish and never come out. Most of this never makes it beyond the community. It becomes part of local folklore, a way to put a narrative skin on the unsettling fact that the ground occasionally coughs up parts of something once alive and now very, very dead. But every so often, the stories intersect with outside interests. Maybe it's a colonial administrator looking for building stone, authorizing new quarrying on the headland. Maybe it's a naturalist cataloguing birds who hears talk in the village about a deep cave with bones like trees. Maybe it's an early speleologist obsessed with mapping underground passages who turns up one season, hires local guides, and asks them if they know of any unexplored holes. And of course, they do. They've been warning their kids away from them for generations. So one day, someone with a notebook and at least a vague sense of scientific curiosity ends up standing at the entrance of a cave that has been catching debris, animals and humans for tens of thousands of years. They lower themselves down or edge their way along a ledge, their light beam cutting across dripstone, bat guano, calcite curtains. And there, half embedded in sediment or eroding from a ledge, is a bone that is clearly human and to their eye alarmingly large. From that moment, the story begins to harden. The first phase is almost always breathless and almost always messy. Measurements are hasty, if they're taken at all. Provenance, the exact spot, depth, orientation and surrounding sediment of the bone is recorded in phrases like "from the second chamber" or "near the entrance," which is archaeologically about as useful as saying "somewhere on the porch." Other bones maybe lie nearby, but only the most striking ones get picked up. The rest are left, trampled or quietly pocketed by helpers as curiosities. Sometimes the finder has medical or anatomical training. Often they don't. They know what a femur looks like because they've seen one in an illustration, and this one seems longer. They know adult teeth are a certain size and this mur seems too big. A ruler might appear. A guess is made. This person would have been at least 8 feet tall. It goes into the notebook or into a letter or into a newspaper. Here's where amplification starts. A short item appears in a local paper. Enormous human bones found in island cave. The tone is skeptical but intrigued. The article mentions that the bones appear much larger than those of an ordinary man and that further study is required. A week later, another paper reprints the story, cutting the hedging language and adding a headline about giants. A month after that, a popular magazine runs a sketch based on a description. And now the bones are colossal. The individual towering over modern men. With every retelling, conditional language erodes. Appears larger becomes is larger. May indicate becomes proves. Early narratives do not just report. They crystallize. They frame how later discoveries are interpreted before those discoveries are even made. And once a story of giants has lodged itself in the public imagination, every subsequent find on that island, every odd bone, every unusually deep footprint in soft sediment, every oversized stone tool risks being pulled into the same gravitational field. From a scientist's perspective, this is both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, publicity brings attention. It alerts universities, museums, and geological surveys that something potentially interesting is eroding out of a cliff or falling from a cave ceiling. Expeditions get funded. Specialists arrive with calipers, GPS units, and proper sample bags. On the other hand, that same publicity preloads expectations. If you come to an island already convinced that a race of giants lived here until 12,000 years ago, every long bone will look a little longer than it really is. Every thick-walled femur of a robust but ordinary human will shimmer for a moment, with the allure of being something more. The earlier scientific visits to such sites historically are riddled with problems that later scholars curse under their breath. Documentation is patchy. A bone might be labeled Cave A with no indication of which layer it came from. Bags of sediment get mixed. The context that allows you to say this bone lay in undisturbed late Pleistocene deposits beneath a layer dated to 10,000 years ago is lost. Provenance disappears. A specimen is sent to a city museum where the curator writes "island giant" on the tag and sticks it in a drawer. Decades later, nobody knows exactly which cave it came from, whether it was associated with stone tools, animal bones, or later burials. Without that chain of evidence, the bone is almost useless for reconstructing deep history. It's a data point floating in time. Selective reporting kicks in too. Early accounts mention the spectacular pieces and ignore the mundane. A long fur makes the paper. The small gracial bones found alongside it never get measured or published. Pathologies, bone thickening from disease, changes from heavy labor, are missed or misinterpreted. The narrative of giants feeds on the extraordinary and quietly discards the ordinary, even when the ordinary is what you need to understand what's really going on. So, how do scientists deal with this flood of ambiguous hype-soaked material? They triage. When an extraordinary claim comes across a desk, giant humans survived on Exile Island until 12,000 years ago, the first question is not, could giants exist? But what exactly is the evidence? That means stripping away every layer of retelling until you get back to things that can be inspected, measured, and dated. At the top of the priority list are finds with good context. Bones recovered in situ, photographed or drawn in place with clear stratigraphy and associated material. A partial skeleton embedded in a known sediment layer is worth much more than a spectacular loose fire that's been handled by half the village. Next come associated artifacts, tools, hearths, shells that can be dated and tied to human activity. Extraordinary evidence in this world is not a single massive bone glowering in a glass case. It is a converging bundle of independent lines of data that all point to the same conclusion. Radiometric dates from multiple materials in the same layer, agreeing within known error margins. Morphological measurements showing that several individuals, not just one, fall consistently outside the range of modern human variation. Clear demonstration that the bones were deposited in ancient sediments, not washed in from a recent burial or a collapsed cemetery. Repeated finds from different sites collected by different teams, all telling the same story. It is slow, unglamorous, often frustrating work. And under that standard, a single dramatic specimen almost never settles species. Identity on its own. A huge fever could belong to an unusually tall but otherwise normal human. A thick skull could be the result of disease or trauma. A giant jaw might be from an extinct large-bodied animal misidentified in poor light. Without a suite of bones from the same individual, or better yet, multiple individuals from controlled excavations, claims about a distinct giant human species remain hypotheses, not conclusions. That doesn't mean early giant stories are worthless. It means they are starting points, not end points. They tell you where to look. This cave, this collapsed sinkhole, this eroding terrace. They preserve in distorted form the memory that the earth there has given up bones that frightened or fascinated people. They can even capture genuine anomalies, bones that, when finally recovered and measured properly, do sit at the edge of what we expect. But the path from where we found something weird in a cave to a distinct large-bodied human lineage survived here until 12,000 years ago is long. And most of it runs through the unglamorous terrain of careful excavation, rigorous documentation, and relentless checking of alternatives. On this island, that path began with rumors and quarry finds and half-remembered tales of skulls in the dark. It would take years before anyone had enough securely documented material to even begin asking with a straight face whether those stories pointed to a real population or to something much more ordinary and no less interesting hiding behind the word giant. Once you have bones on a table instead of half glimpsed in the dark, everything gets both simpler and more complicated. Simpler because there are rules. Human anatomy is not a free-for-all. Certain bones tell you very specific things, and they do it reliably if you know what you're looking at. More complicated because those rules come with caveats. And the caveats are exactly where giants like to hide. In human skeletons, a handful of elements do most of the heavy lifting for estimating stature and more cautiously for thinking about species. The fur, the thigh bone, is king. It's the single best predictor of overall height in modern humans. Its length combined with regression formulas built on thousands of measured skeletons lets you say with reasonable confidence, this person would have stood about so and so tall. The tibia and fibula in the lower leg, the humerus in the upper arm, and to a lesser extent, the bones of the forearm can refine that estimate. The pelvis, skull, and some features of the vertebrae are much more important for sex, ancestry, and species identification than for raw height. If you have a mostly complete long bone from a fully grown adult, unwarped by disease or taphonomically damaged, you can do real science. You can put numbers on things. You can compare those numbers to large data sets from different populations and time periods. But that's the ideal on this island. As on most places with dramatic claims, you almost never start with ideal specimens. You start with fragments. Half a femoral shaft, the top of a tibia, the back half of a jaw, pieces. And fragments are where the problem of scale begins. Imagine you're in that cave, headlamp flickering, looking at a section of femur that seems longer and thicker than anything you've ever seen. You don't have the ends, just a robust shaft. How tall was the person? You have to reconstruct the missing parts in your head. What you choose to imagine will drive your conclusion. If you assume the bone's proportions are just like those of an average modern person, you might extend it to a length that gives you a stature of 7 1/2, 8, 9 feet. If you assume shorter ends, you get a different answer. If the bone actually comes from a stocky, wide-jointed person with relatively short femora for their body size, as many archaic humans did, your giant shrinks dramatically when you plug realistic proportions into the equation. This is not hypothetical. We have historic cases where early investigators took a chunky partial long bone, extrapolated generously, and published astonishing heights. Later re-examination with better comparative samples and more conservative estimates brought those supposed titans back down to the upper end of normal human variation. The same thing happens with skulls and jaws. A mandible with big teeth and a deep, thick body looks huge on its own. Set it next to a sample of robust jaws from cold-adapted or heavily chewing populations and it stops being exceptional. It's still interesting. It might hint at diet or at chronic stress on the chewing muscles, but it no longer demands a new species of 12 Oot Islanders. Layered on top of fragmentary remains are three big biological realities that routinely mess with people's intuitions: sexual dimorphism, population variation, and growth stages. Sexual dimorphism first. In many human groups, males are on average taller and more robust than females. That's not news. But what's easy to forget, especially if your mental picture of normal comes from one modern urban population, is how wide the range can be within a single species. The tallest confirmed modern humans, based on well-documented medical records, push past 8 feet. They're rare, often sick, and not representative. But they are undeniably Homo sapiens. On the other end of the spectrum, healthy adult individuals from some small body populations may stand under 5 feet. Now imagine you have only a big male femur from one end of that spectrum and no female bones, no average bones, nothing to provide context. It will look enormous. Pair that with a narrative about giants and your interpretation is already leaning in one direction. Population variation magnifies this. Human groups adapted to different environments show systematic differences in body build. Cold-adapted populations tend to have shorter limbs and broader bodies conserving heat. People adapted to hot climates tend to be more linear with longer limbs dissipating heat. Island populations under extreme conditions sometimes skew in surprising ways, becoming either dwarfed or oversized relative to mainland relatives. If your comparative yardstick is, say, 19th century European city dwellers, and you walk into an oustry filled with well-fed, physically active late Pleistocene hunter-gatherers, everything looks large for thicker muscle attachment areas are more pronounced, joints are broader. It's like comparing the skeletons of powerlifters to those of office workers and then concluding you've discovered a separate species of superhumans. Finally, growth stages. Children are not just scaled-down adults. Their bones change shape dramatically as they mature. Growth plates fuse at different ages in different bones. Teeth erupt in a known sequence, but the jaws and facial bones continue remodeling around them. A large adolescent with unfused growth plates might look to an untrained eye like an adult giant in the making. A big jaw from a 15-year-old can be mistaken for the undersized jaw of a truly enormous adult. Without careful assessment of fusion, tooth wear, and microscopic features of bone tissue, age estimates can be wildly off, which in turn distort stature and population size estimates. Under all of these conditions, robust bones become rhetorical dynamite. Think about what robust actually means in osteology. Thick cortical walls, heavy shafts, strongly developed muscle attachments, large joint surfaces. Robust bones belong to bodies that did a lot. Hauling, climbing, throwing, walking long distances, growing up on protein-rich diets, dealing with chronic physical stress. They do not automatically belong to bodies that are exceptionally tall. A femur can be short and stout. A humerist can be average in length but built like a crowbar. Spine vertebrae can be thick and blocky without adding a single centimeter to standing height. Without a proper comparative collection, shelves of skeletons from known populations, ages, and sexes, it's incredibly easy to misread heavily built as giant. This is where modern methods start to claw back some clarity from the archival chaos. For a long time, anthropology relied on simple linear measurements: length, breadth, circumference. You'd place calipers at standard points on a bone, write the numbers down, and plug them into formulas derived from reference populations. Those methods are still useful, but they were developed and often calibrated on limited samples, frequently European or North American collections from specific time periods. Apply those formulas uncritically to an island population with a different body build, different proportions, and possibly a different evolutionary history, and your estimates can skew systematically high or low. Today, remeasurement goes beyond what's the maximum length of this fire to what is the detailed 3D shape of this four, and how does that shape compare to thousands of others, digital morphometrics, 3D. Scanning, landmark analysis, shape statistics lets researchers capture the geometry of bones in far more detail than a ruler ever could. You can map out curves, torsion, subtle flares of muscle attachment, the precise way a joint surface is oriented. You can then overlay those digital models onto datasets from modern humans, Neanderthals, Homo erectus, isolated island hominins, and tall and short populations worldwide. Sometimes this kind of reanalysis is deflationary. A famous oversized skull, long touted as evidence of a giant, turns out when scanned and compared to sit comfortably within the upper range of known variation. Its thickness is explained by antemortem trauma and healing, not by a separate species. Sometimes it does the opposite. A jaw or a footbone that early workers misfiled as just another big native skeleton shows a suite of subtle non-modern features, unusual tooth-root shapes, archaic joint surfaces, proportional relationships you don't see in Homo sapiens. It doesn't prove giants, but it raises the possibility of a distinct, perhaps larger-bodied population. Crucially, digital methods also allow you to revisit old estimates built on heroic assumptions. If someone in 1910 wrote, "This enormous fire must indicate a man of at least 2.5 meters," modern researchers can take the same bone, scan it, estimate its full length using models trained on thousands of known skeletons, and then rerun the stature equations using appropriate population-specific parameters. Again and again, when this is done carefully, the spectacular collapses into the impressive. The man of 2.5 meters becomes 1.95 or 2.22 tall, very tall for his time and place, but not beyond human capability. The island of giants becomes an island that at certain times hosted robust, physically demanding lifestyles, perhaps a slight upward shift in average height, perhaps not. Numbers sharpen, stories blur, and that's the tension at the heart of this whole question. Bones on their own, especially fragments, are whispering things. They're suggestive, easily misheard. To make them speak clearly about whether a genuinely large-bodied human lineage survived on this island until 12,000 years ago, you need more than a tape measure and a good imagination. You need context, comparison, and methods designed to catch your own biases in the act. You also need to know not just how big something looks, but how old it really is, and that's where the next set of problems begins. Knowing how old a bone is sounds like it should be easier than figuring out how tall its owner was. You take the thing, you date it, you read off the number. In reality, almost every spectacular claim about late surviving giants lives or dies in the gap between that fantasy and what dating methods actually do. Because there isn't a way to date something 12,000 years old, there's a toolbox. Each tool works on different materials, at different time ranges, and with different vulnerabilities. And if you don't understand those vulnerabilities, it's very easy to fool yourself. Start with the celebrity of the bunch, radiocarbon dating. Radiocarbon works on anything that was once alive and is now dead. Bone, charcoal, wood, seeds, shell within roughly the last 50,000 years. While an organism is living, it's taking in carbon from the atmosphere or from food, and a tiny fraction of that carbon is radioactive carbon-14. When it dies, the carbon-14 clock starts ticking down as the isotope decays. Measure how much is left. Compared to stable carbon, and you get an age. Simple in principle, messy in practice. Bones, for example, don't just sit in the ground untouched for millennia. Groundwater seeps through them. Dissolved carbonates move in and out. Microbes chew and rebuild the collagen that radiocarbon labs actually want to sample. If conservationists in the 1960s helpfully soaked that bone in modern glue to keep it from falling apart, congratulations. You've just added fresh carbon to a supposedly ancient sample. Charcoal has its own traps. A little black fleck in a layer next to a big bone feels like a smoking gun. See, they had fires here. We'll date the charcoal, and that gives us the age of the bone. But radiocarbon doesn't date contexts. It dates atoms in the specific object you put in the machine. That charcoal might be from a campfire 1,000 years after the bone was buried. Or it might have washed down from an older layer above. Or it might be what archaeologists call intrusive, a root. Burned in a recent wildfire, pushed down by burrowing animals now sitting right next to a pliine femur like they've known each other forever. If you want to claim that a human, giant or otherwise, was alive 12,000 years ago, you don't want a bone near a date. You want a date from the bone itself, or from something that you can show graphically and statistically is part of the same event. A cut-marked animal bone in direct contact, a hearth built into an undisturbed burial, a clearly sealed layer that contains both. That word association is where a lot of excitement goes off the rails. In well-run excavations, association is earned, not assumed. You map every find in 3 dimensions. You watch the sediment carefully for signs of disturbance. You log changes in soil color, texture, inclusions. You treat a bone and a piece of charcoal lying a few centimeters apart with suspicion until you can demonstrate that they were put there by the same action at the same time. In older digs, or in I found this amazing skull in a cave stories, that discipline often isn't there. The collector remembers that the bones came from the same layer. The field notes say near half. Decades later, someone dates a piece of charcoal marked level 4, gets a number around 12,000 years ago, and that date starts traveling as if it belongs to every bone in every box labeled level 4. It doesn't. At best, it's a candidate association. At worst, it's a coincidence. Radiocarbon is also not a magic years ago counter. The machine spits out an age in radiocarbon years which are based on a theoretical constant level of carbon-14 in the atmosphere. But the real atmosphere has mood swings. Solar activity, Earth's magnetic field, even human industrial activity have changed the background radiocarbon level over time. To turn a radiocarbon age into a calendar age about 12,000 years ago in the way a historian would say it, you have to calibrate it against independent records, tree rings, visions, corals. A calibration curve wiggles. In some periods, a small difference in radiocarbon years translates to a very tight window in calendar years. In others, you get plateaus where everything between, say, 11,800 and 12,300 radiocarbon years looks more or less the same. So when someone says these bones date 12,000 years ago, what they often have, if you read the fine print, is something like this sample has a radiocarbon age that when calibrated gives a 95% probability of falling somewhere between 11,500 and 12,700 calendar years before present. That's still powerful. It does put you in the late Pliocene/early Holocene transition. It does put you in a world where ice sheets are collapsing and sea levels are rising, but it is not an exact timestamp on a death certificate. It's a probability cloud. Now move to methods that don't care about carbon. On limestone islands, which is what many of these giant story islands are, you often see uranium series dating. Groundwater carries tiny amounts of uranium which gets locked into calite as stalagmites grow and as dissolved minerals re-enters sediments. Some of that uranium decays over time into thorium at a known rate. Measure the uranium to thorium ratio and you get an age for when that calcite formed. Here's the key. Uranium series dates the rock, not the bone sitting in front of it. If a flowstone layer lies on top of a fossil-bearing deposit and gives an age of 13,000 years, you can say the bones underneath must be at least that old. That's a minimum age. If another calcite layer underneath the bones is 20,000 years old, you have another bracket. These fossils are between 20,000 and 13,000 years. That's useful, but it still doesn't tell you whether a particular big femur at the interface belongs to the very end of that span or somewhere in the middle. Luminescence methods like optically stimulated luminescence OSL attack the problem sideways. Quartz and feldspar grains in sediments accumulate trapped electrons as they're exposed to background radiation. Sunlight resets that clock by emptying the traps. When grains get buried and shielded from light, the clock starts again. In the lab, you stimulate those grains, count the trapped electrons and estimate how long it has been since they last saw daylight. OSL dates the moment of burial of the sediment, not the age of any fossil in it. A sand layer dated to around 12,000 years suggests that any bones still embedded in that sand have been there at least that long. But if a burrowing animal dragged a bone from an older layer into that younger sand, or if a carbonate cemented block slumped down from a cave wall, the association breaks. Stratigraphic correlation is older still, and both incredibly powerful and incredibly easy to abuse. In principle, it's simple. Sediments accumulate in layers. If you can trace a distinctive layer, a volcanic ash, a colored clay, a particular fossil assemblage from one place to another, you can say that anything in that layer is the same age, even if you only have a direct date at one point. In practice, real sediments are messy. Layers pinch out and reappear. Erosion cuts channels. People dig pits and refill them with mixed material. If your stratigraphy is meticulously recorded, correlation can extend hard dates across a landscape. If it's based on this looks about the same as that, it can smuggle a 12,000-year date from a well-defined site to a poorly known one where the bones happen to attract more attention. Put all of this together, and late survival claims for any unusual human, giant-bodied, small-bodied, or just weirdly proportioned, start to cluster into three categories. First, the weakest bones that are simply said to be from the Pliocene or around 12,000 years old because of the general age of the cave, the presence of nearby dated material, or long retold field memories. No direct dates, fuzzy association, often contaminated or heavily handled specimens. These are the stories that sound dramatic in books but tend to evaporate under scrutiny. Second, intermediate cases, good dates on sediments or flowstones that bracket the fossil layer, decent stratigraphic descriptions, maybe one or two radiocarbon dates on associated material, but still no date on the exact specimen being touted as a giant. These can't be dismissed out of hand. They might represent real late surviving populations. There might also be cases where the most impressive bones are older relics sitting in younger contexts. Third, the gold standard directly dated bones, ideally with multiple samples from the same individual or closely associated individuals. Independent methods that agree within error, clear documentation of stratigraphy, careful screening for contamination. These are rare, expensive to obtain, and frankly kind of boring from a sensationalist point of view because they tend to shave off the extremes. Redating campaigns are where the rubber meets the road. When a new lab with better pretreatment protocols, smaller sample requirements, and updated calibration curves goes back to classic giant sites too. Things often happen. A lot of dramatic dates move. Charcoal that was once reported as 12,000 years old turns out under more rigorous pretreatment to be 4,000 years old. Recent bushfire, not Ice Age hearth. Bone collagen that was borderline barely holding on yields a smear of young carbon revealing heavy contamination from groundwater or consolidants. Supposedly late surviving archaic humans recede into the safer earlier Pliocene, right where most paleoanthropologists expected them to be. Sometimes, though, the opposite occurs. A specimen long assumed to be just another old bone is sampled carefully, yielding clean collagen, clear isotopic signatures, and a radiocarbon age that really does fall at the very end of the plot. A flowstone once dated with wide error bars is remeasured with improved uranium series techniques, tightening the minimum age for overlying fossils. OSL dates are refined with better dose rate estimates, narrowing a burial window that used to span several thousand years. In those cases, late survival stops being a rumor and becomes a testable fact. Here is a human with such and such anatomical features demonstrably alive at this time. If that human also has unusually large, consistently large, and anatomically distinctive bones, now you're in interesting territory. But getting there requires a kind of discipline that myth-making doesn't like, a willingness to see favorite dates collapse, to admit when association is weaker than you thought. Treat every 12,000-year-old claim as a hypothesis that needs to survive multiple independent attempts to tear it down. Only after you've done that, after you've nailed down when these island people lived, does it really make sense to ask the next question. How did they live? If bones and dates tell you who and when, tools and trash tell you how. Archaeologists have a slightly unromantic phrase for this, the archaeological fingerprint of a group, not a single object, not one cool spear point or a weird-looking hammerstone, but a whole package of habits that taken together mark a distinct way of life. The kinds of stones people choose, the way they strike flakes, the shapes they prefer, how they use fire, where they throw their garbage, what ends up in that garbage, fish bones or deer bones, shells or nuts, charred tubers or bird wings. If there really was a population of unusually large humans hanging on an island until about 12,000 years ago, they wouldn't just leave big skeletons. They'd leave a fingerprint. You'd expect their sites to show up as patterned, repeatable clusters of behavior. Maybe a particular stone tool technology that appears suddenly, hangs around for a few thousand years, then vanishes. Maybe distinctive hearth types, big communal fires or carefully lined roasting pits. Maybe a very specific diet signal, an island where most people are eating small fish and shellfish. But at a few sites, you find heavy butchery of large game that would be hard to hunt without serious muscle and coordination. That's the dream scenario. In reality, the fingerprint is often smudged. Start with stone. Islands are perfect laboratories for this because they force choices. You don't get infinite raw material. If your island is mostly coral, limestone with just a couple of volcanic outcrops, Everyone who wants sharp edges ends up raiding the same basalt or CH veins. That alone makes the tools from different groups start to look more similar than they might on a continent where stone options are endless. But even within those constraints, traditions show. In one period, toolmakers might favor large, thick flakes used as simple choppers, good for smashing bones and cracking shell. In another, they might invest more effort in long, narrow blades, carefully pressure-flaked into standardized points. Those differences aren't random. They record choices about hunting strategies, food processing, and social learning. If you look across time on the same island, you can sometimes see clean technological phases. Layer A, chunky core tools and expedient flakes. Layer B, thousands of years later, refined standardized microliths. Tiny blades that can be slotted into wooden or bone handles to make composite tools. Jump again to Layer C and maybe you start seeing polished stone adzes, perfect for woodworking and canoe building. Now imagine you have bones of very large humans that seem to fall into the late end of that sequence somewhere near Layer C. One way to argue that they belong to a distinct population would be if their layers sat on top of or slightly aside from that expected sequence, with a toolkit that doesn't quite match what came before or after. Maybe they keep using older, heavier core tools when everyone else has shifted to finer blades. Maybe they invent a new kind of large spear point tailored to ambushing big prey in dense island forests. Maybe the way they retouch their flakes, the angles they prefer, the way they recycle broken tools. Each of those tiny technical decisions repeats across multiple sites associated with their bones, but nowhere else. That repeating pattern is the distinct group signal. It's subtle and it only pops out when you compare across regions and times because stone tools are one of the few things you can compare that way. The same hand axe form appears in Africa and Europe, separated by hundreds of thousands of years, and you can track changes in flaking style like dialects in a language. Islands have their own dialects. Sometimes you even see clear signs of visitors, tool types that match a mainland tradition suddenly appearing in a coastal cave, hinting at contact or colonization. For a supposed island giant population, the question becomes, do their sites look like an isolated, conservative version of mainland technology? Do they show abrupt innovations that don't match either the earlier island sequence or known mainland styles? Or do they just look like more of the same sprinkled among everyone else's debris? Stone alone isn't enough. Fire use sharpens the picture. Controlled fire leaves its own layered signature. Reddened soil, charcoal lenses, cracked and fire-spooled rock, arrangements of stones used as hearth linings or windbreaks. On some late Pliene islands you see tiny dispersed hearths, small short-lived fires consistent with mobile foragers cooking a quick meal and moving on. On others you start to get big long-term fire features, large roasting pits, repeated rebuilding of hearths in the same place, thick ash dumps. Those differences speak to group size, mobility, and social organization. A population of a large-bodied, possibly very strong humans might lean into intensive fire use in ways smaller groups didn't. They'd be capable of hauling larger logs, building bigger communal fires, and maybe processing bigger animals all at once. If sites associated with their bones show particularly massive hearths or unusual concentrations of burned bone and heated stone, that starts looking like part of their fingerprint. Site organization paints the most human picture of all. Even in very simple camps, people tend to cluster activities. One area becomes the main hearth zone. Another becomes a napping floor littered with flakes. Sleeping spaces are often cleaner with fewer sharp objects. Trash accumulates downwind or downslope. If a group revisits the same place, those patterns stack in the sediments like ghost floor plans. When archaeologists peel back those floors, they're looking for consistent layouts. Do people always put the hearths near the cave mouth or tucked back in a sheltered alcove? Is butchery always happening a few meters away? Are children's discarded beads and small tools concentrated in certain corners suggesting play or craft zones? If you had a distinct island population, even if they were interbreeding with newcomers, you might see recurrent quirks. The way they arrange hearths, the distance they keep between sleeping spaces and garbage, the habit of digging small storage pits versus just leaving things on the surface. All of that is before you even ask, what were they eating? Food remains are brutally honest witnesses. Large mammals leave big bones with cut marks, impact scars from marrow extraction, and sometimes piles of cracked fragments near hearths. Marine foraging leaves heaps of shells, fish vertebrae, turtle carapaces. Plant processing can leave grinding stones with characteristic polish, microscopic starch grains embedded in their surfaces, and layers of charred seeds and nutshells. On islands, shell mittens, ancient garbage dumps of shells and bones can grow into hills. They're often stratified. Big oysters and clams in one layer, more fish and crustaceans in another, sometimes a shift to more terrestrial foods when sea levels change or reefs die back. If a supposed giant population had specific prey preferences, say targeting the largest native herbivores or specialized deep water fishing requiring big boats and strong rowers, you might see abrupt shifts in the fossil record that track their supposed occupation. Before them, modest hunting of small deer and a lot of shellfish during their time. Intensive exploitation of large animals, more spear-damaged bones, maybe even overhunting signatures where big prey become rarer through the layers after they vanish. A return to smaller game and shellfish. It would be tempting to draw a straight line. Big people, big prey, big impact. The catch is that sites are almost never that clean. Islands are crossroads. Storms move sand and bones. People revisit the same caves and beaches for thousands of years. Later groups dig into older deposits to bury their dead, builds or minestone tools from older layers. The result is what archaeologists call mixed occupations. Tools from different periods get jumbled together. A finely made microlith from a relatively recent visitor can sit right next to a heavy core tool dropped thousands of years earlier. Shells from a younger mitten can wash down into a pocket among older bones. A single fireplace can cut through multiple ancient floors, gathering up whatever was in its path and burning it into one misleadingly unified ashlands. If you walk into that chaos looking for giants, it's easy to see what you want. You find a very large femur in a mixed layer that also contains late stone tools, a robust hearth, and lots of large animal bone. And you stitch them into a single story. Here, 12,000 years ago, a band of giants roasted megafauna with sophisticated technology. But each piece could belong to a different chapter. The big four might be tens of thousands of years older, eroded out of a cave wall and slumping into younger sediment. The flashy tools might be from a later, smaller-bodied group, revisiting the site. The impressive hearth could be medieval, dug down into the ancient deposits by islanders who had no idea they were cooking over Pliene bones. Mixed occupations blend tool types, food remains, and fire traces into pieces. Rewritten manuscripts where faint earlier texts mingle with bold new ink. Interpreting them means reading between the lines, not just the words that jump out. For a late surviving giant population, the standard of proof gets higher. It's not enough to have big bones somewhere in a cave and interesting tools somewhere in the same general deposit. You want multiple sites with repeatable combinations of tool styles, hearth forms, and diet signatures that line up with the independently dated window when those giants supposedly lived. You want an archaeological fingerprint that shows up again and again, not just a single oversized smudge. Because only then can you start to say that you're not just looking at scattered remains of big-boned individuals in a longus landscape, but at the daily life of a distinct island people. And if that fingerprint is faint, partially erased and overlain by others, there's one more kind of trace that tends to survive where bones and tools fail. Footprints. Footprints feel different. A bone can be anyone's. A stone tool could have been picked up, reused, dropped miles from where it was made. A footprint, that's a moment. A body pressed into soft ground, weight shifted, toes flexed, mud squeezed up between them. For a second there was a living, breathing person right there, and the trace of that second gets locked into the earth. So when people hear giant humans and then see a photo of an enormous footprint in rock, it hits hard. It feels like a time traveler's selfie. Physical proof, a literal step. That's exactly why footprints are so powerful in this story and why they're so dangerous. Because almost everything that makes them emotionally convincing also makes them scientifically slippery. Start with the basic problem. The ground lies. Soft sediment is not a tape measure. It's more like memory foam that won't stop moving. If you weigh more than the surface, can comfortably hold, your foot sinks deeper. The edges crumble out. Wet mud can slump and ooze, stretching the print sideways as your foot pulls free. A slide on a slope can drag the heel mark out behind you, turning a normal step into a comically long one. Then there's time. When a print first forms, it might be crisp. You can see toe pads, nail impressions, skin ridges. Give it an hour in the sun, the surface starts to crack. Give it a day of rain. Water pulls in the depression, softens the sediment at the edges, and when it drains away, the print is wider, rounder, less distinct. Give it weeks and months of wind and trampling animals and shrinking, swelling clays. The neat outline blurs. Small prints vanish entirely. Big ones survive, but they're often swollen, more like blobby basins than feet. If those sediments eventually harden, turning from mud into stone, you've fossilized not a foot, but a process. A footprint plus slumping plus erosion plus chemical changes. By the time we see it millions or thousands of years later, it may easily measure bigger than the actual foot that made it. That's why paleontologists are so cautious when someone points to a giant track and says, "Look, a 12T man." You can't just grab a ruler and do foot length times some magic number. You have to ask, what was the substrate? How wet was it? How much of the edges migrated? Has infilling sediment made the print seem longer or wider than it originally was? This is where the temptation kicks in. If you go hunting for giant tracks on an island where stories of huge people are already circulating, your eyes you see an eroded depression that's vaguely foot-shaped, and your brain snaps the puzzle together. Heel, arch, ball, toes. It's like seeing faces in clouds, and once you've labeled it a giant footprint, everything else you notice follows that label. The big hollow in front, clearly a big toe. That ridge on the side must be the arch. The fact that the toe region is mushy and irregular and only kind of align with an actual foot, easy to wave away, it's just erosion. Scientists fight that bias by being boringly systematic. Instead of starting with, is this proof of a giant, they start with, what exactly is this thing in the rock? That means documenting, not just gawking. The modern toolkit is surprisingly high-tech for something as simple as a foot in mud. Photogrammetry comes first. You take dozens, sometimes hundreds of overlapping photographs from different angles, with scale bars and reference points. Software stitches those images into a 3D model accurate down to a few millimeters. Then, if the trackway seems promising, you bring out structured light or laser 3D scanners. These devices sweep a projected pattern across the surface and measure distortions, building an even finer digital copy. Why all this digital fuss? Because once you have a precise 3D record, you can do more than say looks big. You can measure depth profiles across the heel, midfoot, and toes. You can compare the left and right side for symmetry. You can overlay hypothetical foot shapes and see which ones actually fit the depressions. Meanwhile, sedimentologists are doing the unglamorous work, slicing tiny cores from around and beneath the print, looking at grain size, layering mineral content. They're trying to reconstruct the environment at the moment the track was made. Was this a beach swash zone hit by repeated waves that could have smeared the edges? A muddy floodplain that cracked as it dried, a dune surface where collapse would naturally exaggerate the size of any depression. They'll look for microlaminations sucked down beneath the print, showing how the weight deformed the layers. Those deformation patterns can tell you not just that something heavy stepped there, but sometimes the direction of movement, and even whether the footing slipped. Only after all that do you get to the question people really care about. How big was the track maker? In principle, there's a relationship between foot length and body height. In living humans, it's been measured again and again. On average, foot length is about 15 to 16% of stature. So a 26 centimeter foot goes with a person around 165 centimeters tall. A 30 centimeter foot suggests something more like 185 to 190 centimeters. So, if you measure a fossil footprint at, say, 40 centimeters, it's tempting to shout over 2.5 meters tall. But those neat formulas come from barefoot people walking on firm ground, measured precisely with no erosion, no mud slumping, no infill. With fossil tracks, each of those assumptions breaks. If the foot sank deeper than average, the edges of the print may have been pushed outwards, making it longer and wider than the real foot. If the person was moving fast, the heel might land lightly, but the forefoot slammed down, stretching the print forward. On slopes, the whole impression skews, so scientists wrap their estimates in error bars. Instead of saying, "This track maker was 2.3 meters tall," they'll say, "Best guess between 1.88 and 2.2 meters with considerable uncertainty." That considerable uncertainty is doing a lot of work, and that's just one print. A single oversized footprint in isolation proves almost nothing. It could be misinterpreted. It could be a weird erosion pocket. It could be a normal-sized human track distorted by messy sediment. It could even be an animal print that is weathered into a humanish outline. What changes the game is trackways. A true trackway is a series of footprints left by the same individual in sequence with consistent spacing and orientation. Not just one big depression over here and another sort of foot shape 10 meters away, but a clearly connected trail. From that you can measure stride length, pace, angle, variation in depth from step to step. You can tell if the person was walking, running, limping, turning. If we were trying to argue for a late surviving population of exceptionally large humans on an island, this is what we'd want to see. Multiple trackways at multiple sites, all securely dated to the right time window around 12,000 years ago. Those dates would need to be independent of the tracks themselves. Radiocarbon on organic material in the same sedimentary layer may be optically stimulated luminescence dating of the sand grains that record when they were last exposed to light. The prints would need to be clearly human, not just vaguely foot-shaped, but showing a heel-to-toe progression, medial arch, distinct toe pads with proportions that match human feet rather than, say, a large bird, a bear, or an artful erosion channel. Within those human-like prints, we'd want a cluster at the upper end of size, not just one anomaly. If an island's fossil track record includes dozens of clear human footprints and only a single purported giant print that's oddly shaped and heavily eroded, that's not a giant population. That's an outlier begging for alternative explanations. But if you start to see a pattern, numerous tracks where even the smallest adult tell. Looking ink prints are larger than typical mainland feet for that period. Children's prints scaled up accordingly. Consistent stride lengths and body mass estimates that all suggest bigger than average people that begins to look like a real biological signal. Then comes integration with everything else. Do the giantish trackways occur in the same stratigraphic horizons as the big bones? Do they show up near the distinctive hearths and toolkits that might represent that population's archaeological fingerprint? Is there any sign in the same layers of unusual hunting patterns, environmental impact, or changes in settlement that a large body people might produce? Only when those threads cross, bones, tools, fire, food, footprints, do footprints move from dramatic anecdote to piece of a coherent story. Without that convergence, they're just temptations. Temptations to believe that a blurred depression in stone is a direct handshake with a forgotten race of island giants. Temptations that once you've touched them are very hard to let go of. And yet, hovering alongside the physical traces, there's another kind of footprint that refuses to erode quite as easily. The stories people tell about who walks these islands before them. Stories of data that learned how to survive. They move differently than bones and stones do. Fossils just lie there. You can ignore them for 1,000,000 years until some curious primate with a trowel digs them up. Stories insist. They get told at the fire, at the shoreline, on the trail. They cling to melodies, to jokes, to taboos. They shed details that don't matter to the people who carry them, and they exaggerate the parts that do. So, when you land on an island where elders say, "There were giants here before us," you don't just shrug and walk away. You also don't take it as a signed affidavit from prehistory. You have to ask, what exactly does a story like that remember? Because oral tradition is not one thing. Sometimes it really is a fossilized encounter, a generalized, mythologized memory of something people actually saw. Other times it's a metaphor that hardened over centuries or a social rule wearing a monster costume so that kids will listen. And sometimes it's not old at all. It's yesterday's newspaper headline fed back into the mythic echo chamber. On islands, you often see the same themes about giants repeating, even in cultures that never contacted each other. Giants as outsiders, giants as outsiders, giants as builders, as dangers at the edge of the map. The outsider version usually lives on the frontier, up in the high mountains, deep in the forest, across the water on a smaller wind-scraped rock. Those people over there are different. They're huge. They're cruel. They steal cattle. They eat humans. That's an easy pattern to understand. Humans use exaggeration to draw boundaries. If the folks in the next valley are rivals, your stories turn them into literal ogres. Ancestors are trickier. In some traditions, the giants are the ones who prepared the land. They cleared forests, moved boulders, dug terraces, carved paths. They lived in the time when everything was bigger. Bigger trees, bigger animals, bigger people. That sounds mythic, golden age talk. But it can also be a cultural way of acknowledging that the landscape bears marks older than anyone remembers. Eroded earthworks, massive stone alignments, quarries. If you can't imagine your own grandparents hauling those blocks into place with ropes and cooperative labor, it's tempting to say it must have been the people before, the big ones. Builders are an extension of that. Give a community a pile of megaliths or cyclopean walls, and eventually someone will say, giants did this. The scale itself demands an explanation. For archaeologists, that's not an answer, but it is a clue. Because wherever you find persistent stories about only giants could have built that, you almost always find something physically unusual in the landscape, engineering that pushed the limits of what small low-tech groups can do, or natural formations that look implausibly deliberate. And then there are the stories of danger. Giants who throw rocks from cliffs. Giants who live in caves and catch fishermen. Giants who roam the beaches at night and leave enormous tracks in the sand. Here we're back in the territory of that emotional footprint. A giant you're told to fear as a standing for real hazards. Treacherous headlands, rip currents, steep ravines, where a fall means death. But none of that means these stories are just metaphors. They're often blends. Maybe 500 years ago, a community really did encounter unusually tall raiders from a different island, or a rare large-bodied individual born among them. Maybe they really did find enormous bones protruding from a cliff, proboscidean ribs and femurs that looked unnervingly human at distance. Those impressions sink into the mud of cultural memory. Over generations they get walked on by other events, other fears, other morals. The track that survives is bigger and blurrier than the original foot, but it's still anchored to something that happened. The question is, how do you use that? How do you listen carefully enough that tradition can help you without turning it into courtroom evidence for a lost species of island titans? Anthropologists tend to start with patterns, not punchlines. If one storyteller mentions giants once in passing, that's interesting but thin. If dozens of people in different villages who haven't spent their lives reading the same internet forums independently talk about big people who lived in the caves above the Western Bay and ate this specific kind of shellfish, your ears perk up. Now you have a geographical pointer. Caves above the Western Bay and a behavioral one. Shell middens with a particular species. Those are testable in the ordinary archaeological way. You can hike to those caves. You can map them, look for hearths, charred shells, lithic scatter. You can date the deposits. You can see if there's any sign that something unusual was happening there 12,000 years ago. In that sense, tradition works like an old, hazy map. The scale is off. The monsters in the margins are symbolic, but the promontory and the river mouth are often in the right places. Used this way, stories don't have to be literally true to be practically useful. They're a sampling strategy. They help you choose where to dig, where to scan, what features to pay extra attention to. But there's a catch. The moment an island's giant stories get noticed by the outside world, a feedback loop can start that quietly rewrites them. A travel blogger posts an article, Mystery of the Island Giants. A local tourism office realizes that's catchy and starts printing brochures. Newspaper reporters show up, ask leading questions. So, you've always believed in giants here, right? People wanting to be hospitable and interesting lean into the narrative. Kids here. Tourists asking about giants more than they hear their own grandparents' older, messier, less dramatic versions of the tale. Over a couple of decades, the story smooths out and standardizes around what outsiders already think it should be. Add the internet, and it accelerates. A rumor that started in one village gets copy-pasted onto every mention of the island. YouTube thumbnails show photoshopped skeletons. Forums argue heatedly about suppressed evidence. Pretty soon, if you try to interview people about their traditions, half of what they tell you is contaminated by things they read last year, not things passed down for centuries. If you aren't careful, you'll mistake that recent echo for ancient memory. This is where working with local historians and elders matters. You ask, what did your grandparents say specifically? What words did they use? Were these stories told at ceremonies or only when tourists came by? Are there older versions written down by missionaries, colonial officials, or early ethnographers that clearly predate the modern giant craze? Those older layers can sometimes be peeled back. You may discover that where people now say giant humans, their great-grandparents just said strong people, or the ones who came before, with no emphasis on height at all. Or the reverse, a once vivid tradition about long-legged people who could cross the channel in a few strides, might have been flattened into vague talk about spirits by later religious conversions, only to be reinflated as giants under the influence of TV documentaries. So you treat the stories like a stratigraphic column, recent sediments on top, memes, tourism slogans, clickbait, deeper layers, consistent motifs, place names, references to specific foods, tools, animals. Somewhere at the bottom, if you're lucky, is the original contact surface where human perception met an odd reality. A strange bone, a peculiar skeleton, a memory of unusually big neighbors. And even if you never quite reach that layer, tradition can still guide your boots. If multiple independent lines of oral history keep circling the same headland, the same inland lake, the same stretch of cliff as where the big ones lived, you'd be foolish not to run a survey there. Not because the elders said so, therefore giants. Because the elders live with the landscape in a way visiting scientists don't. They know where the unusual caves are, which rocks fall, which trails feel older than the current village. Beach spits have always been considered taboo for reasons nobody can explain anymore. Those are precisely the places that tend to preserve archaeological and paleontological surprises. When you combine that lived knowledge with remote sensing, LiDAR revealing hidden terraces under forest canopy, ground-penetrating radar picking up buried walls, drone surveys mapping inaccessible cliffs, you start to see how stories and science can actually cooperate. Tradition points, survey confirms, or refineses, excavation tests, dating anchors. At every step you keep two guardrails in place. One, you never treat a tale as a measurement. The giants were twice as tall as us is not a data point you plug into an equation. It's a way of saying they were noticeably bigger and it mattered. Two, you stay alert to contamination. If a story element only appears after the first newspaper article about giant skeletons in the 1970s or after a particular sensational book came out, you flag it as suspect. Not worthless, but clearly modern. What you're left with, if you're patient, is a quieter residue. Hints that some people long ago were seen as physically imposing compared to others, or that certain places now empty were once associated with a different kind of people, distinct enough that later arrivals remembered them as something other than just us. Do those hints prove a lost population of island-adapted giant humans survived until 12,000 years ago? No, they can't. Stories alone can't distinguish between a tall but otherwise ordinary human group, a misremembered episode of warfare, or the discovery of oversized animal bones. But they can draw a dotted line on the map that says, if you're looking for something strange, start here. And when you do start there, when you core the marsh, trench the terrace, sift the cave floor, you sometimes find that the ground has been quietly telling the same story all along. Which brings us to the next step in this mystery. If there really were big people on this island near the end of the Ice Age, were they just tall members of our own species or something else entirely? So, let's bite the hard question. When people on this island talk about the big ones, are we dealing with unusually tall Homo sapiens? Or is there any chance they belong to a different branch of the human family tree? To even ask that in a serious way, you have to understand how slippery the word species is when you're dealing with fossil humans. In high school biology, the rule is simple. If two animals can mate and have fertile offspring, they're the same species. If they can't, they're different species. Nice, clean, useless. Because you can't go back 20,000 years and ask two skeletons if they could have had grandkids together. Paleoanthropologists are stuck with bones, stone tools, and if they're very lucky, a bit of ancient DNA. So species in this world becomes more of a working label than a sharp line. You're looking at patterns. These skulls consistently different from those skulls. Do these bones fall into a tight cluster of shapes and proportions that don't overlap much with anything else we know? Do they show up in a particular time window and region with traits that stay stable over thousands of years? If yes, you start thinking distinct lineage. If not, you're probably just seeing normal variation within one species. That's why arguments about Homo floresiensis, the tiny hobbits from Flores, got so heated. Some researchers saw the small brains and odd wrist bones and said, new species. Others said, no, this is a population of modern humans with developmental issues or disease. Same fossils, same measurements, completely different species labels depending on how you interpret variation. Now, spin the globe to the opposite end of the scale. We're not asking about dwarfs here. We're asking about giants. Does prehistory give us any examples of late surviving humans that were one, clearly different from us too? Living shockingly recently, three, and only discovered because someone got curious on a remote island or in a forgotten cave. Yes, several. Homo floresiensis on Flores, Homo luzonensis in the Philippines, late Neanderthals in Gibraltar and Croatia. Denisvan ghosts lurking in the DNA of people living today in Tibet and New Guinea. All of them show the same basic pattern. For most of human history, there wasn't one kind of human. There were many overlapping in time, sharing landscapes, occasionally sharing genes. And crucially for our island story, some of them hung on in little ecological corners far longer than anyone expected. On Flores, hobbits seem to have survived until about 50,000 years ago, maybe a bit later. Neanderthals lasted to roughly 40,000 years ago in Europe's refuges. On the Alayan, Siberia, Neanderthals and Denisovans were still bumping into each other and having children well within the last 100,000 years. So, the basic idea that another human species could have survived in isolation long after the main line of Homo sapiens had spread is not science fiction. It's already happened several times. The question is whether giants fit that pattern. If you're going to claim our island's big people were a separate species, you need a lot more than they were tall. Body size alone is one of the worst ways to draw a species boundary. Modern humans already come in a huge range of heights. Take the shortest average populations and the tallest average populations alive today, and you can squeeze nearly half a meter of difference between them. Throw in nutrition, childhood disease, social status, and the curve stretches even more. So, if all you have is a femur that suggests someone 6'6" or 7'2", that's interesting, but it's not enough. What paleoanthropologists look for are traits that point to a different developmental program, not just the same program turned up to 11. Think about skull shape. Are the brow ridges unusually thick and protruding? Or are they the delicate arches we see in us? Is the forehead high and rounded or low and receding? How is the back of the skull shaped, globular like us or elongated like many archaic humans? Dental pattern. Tooth size and shape are incredibly conservative. Are the murs huge and shovel-shaped or small and modern? Is there a unique combination of premolars and molars that doesn't match known Homo sapiens variation? Limb proportions. Are the arms and legs scaled the way they are in tall modern populations, or do they follow a different rule? Unusually long thigh bones relative to lower legs or vice versa. Neanderthals, for instance, have short stocky limbs optimized for cold climates. Flores hobbits have proportions that look more like very early Homo than like us. Joint surfaces, the shape of the hip socket, the angle of the knee, the articulation of the ankle, all of these carry a signature of how a human walked, ran, climbed. You can be tall and still move like a perfectly ordinary human. Or you can be tall and move in a way that hints at a different evolutionary history. Wrist and hand bones. These can look surprisingly primitive even when the rest of the skeleton looks modern. Changes in how the thumb and wrist bones articulate tell you about fine manipulation, tool use, and sometimes about deep lineage splits. If an island giant skeleton turned up that was simply an oversized version of a normal modern human, modern skull, modern teeth, modern limb, proportions just bigger than would not justify a new species. That would be a cool data point about stature, diet, maybe a founder effect in a small population, but still squarely in Homo sapiens territory. For a separate human species, you'd need those other differences to stack up in a consistent way. And consistency is the other key. One weird skeleton doesn't make a species. You can get all sorts of pathological changes from disease, injury, hormonal disorders, inbreeding. An individual with a pituitary tumor can grow extremely tall with thickened bones and odd proportions and then die without leaving a genetically distinct population. To argue for homalensis, the giants, you'd need multiple individuals, not one enormous four, not one impressive skull, a sample of skeletons, ideally from different sexes and ages that all show the same distinctive pattern. Repeated traits, the same unusual skull shape, the same dental quirks, the same limb proportions showing up over and over again. That suggests a breeding population, not a one-off medical case. Good dates. You'd have to show that these people really did live in the time frame you're claiming, around or slightly before 12,000 years ago, as opposed to 50,000 or 100,000 or 500 years. Radiocarbon dating, stratigraphy, maybe even luminescence dating for sediments. No hand-waving. Clear separation from known Homo sapiens remains. Ideally, you'd find layers where only the giant morphology appears, then later layers with clear modern humans or vice versa. If the two morphologies are fully mixed in time and space with no consistent differences, it gets much harder to argue for a separate lineage. And then there's the genetic wild card. In the best-case scenario, you'd pull ancient DNA out of those island bones. You'd line it up with Neanderthals, Denisovans, and us and see where it fits. That's how Denisovan were discovered in the first place. One finger bone, one molar, and a genome that said, this is neither Neanderthal nor modern human. But hybrids make this messy. We already know Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, and Denisovans interbred. Many living people carry small percentages of Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA. In some cases, like high-altitude Tibetans, that archaic DNA is doing important work. So, what if your island giants were themselves hybrids? Imagine a mostly modern human population with a strong dose of some archaic lineage that boosted stature or altered limb proportions. In bones, they might look mostly like us with a few odd quirks. In DNR, they'd sit inside the broad umbrella of Homo sapiens, but with patches that look foreign. Do you call that a new species? Most paleoanthropologists wouldn't. They'd call it an admix population, a local group shaped by gene flow from different human lines. And that's another reason species labels in human evolution are more like pushpins on a map than brick walls. The more we learn about ancient DNA, the more our picture of deep time looks less like a tree and more like a braided river. Channels splitting and rejoining, flows crossing and mixing. In that braided landscape, a hypothetical island of tall, somewhat odd-looking humans around 12,000 years ago could be a perfectly ordinary Homo sapiens group at the high end of the height curve. A Homo sapiens group with some archaic ancestry that gave them a few unusual traits. Or, in the most radical scenario, the very last remnants of a lineage that had been diverging from us for hundreds of thousands of years. All three are logically possible. Only one of them deserves its own species name. And until you have the right kind of evidence, multiple skeletons, consistent anatomical differences, solid dates, and ideally some genetic data, science has to sit on its hands and say, interesting rumor, maybe even a real population, but not a new species, not yet, which raises an awkward follow-up. If there really were large-bodied people on the island at the end of the Ice Age, and they weren't a separate species, what else could explain the bones and the stories? The first alternative is the least glamorous and the most common in real excavations. You're not looking at a giant human at all. You're looking at a mix of bones from different animals dumped together by geology, erosion, and time, then mentally stitched into a single creature by a human brain that really wants a story. This happens constantly in cave sites and coastal deposits. Imagine a limestone cave on a cliff above the sea. Over thousands of years, predators drag in carcasses, floods wash in debris. Bats and birds nest in the ceiling, dropping bones and guano. Human groups use the cave occasionally as a shelter or burial place. Now, fast forward, the roof collapses. The sediment gets churned. Later, a small stream cuts through the deposit and resorts the bones by size and density. By the time a modern researcher or a curious villager walks in, that cave floor is a smoothie of species and time. Periods. A giant deer femur might be lying right next to a human pelvis. A macaque skull might be a few centimeters from a human humerus. A chunk of proboscidean rib could be sitting on top of a human tibia. If you're used to reading skeletons bone by bone, you see a crowded jigsaw puzzle. If you're not, and you're emotionally primed to expect giants, it's easy, almost irresistible to see one huge person where there are actually 5 different animals. Even trained scientists can get tripped up by mixed deposits. Early in the history of paleoanthropology, there were several famous cases where primitive humans turned out to be modern human skulls mixed with very old, very large animal bones. So when you hear about a handful of big bones from a disturbed site, this is the first filter. Are all these pieces really from the same individual or even the same species? You check, do the joint surfaces match in size and shape? Does the left side of the body have a partner on the right? Are the bones the same age when you test them? Or are you quietly mixing something that died 40,000 years ago with something that died 4,000 years ago? If the answer keeps coming back no or uncertain, the giant starts to shrink. Then there's the second possibility, which is actually pretty well documented in medical literature: pathological gigantism. We know that in modern humans, pituitary tumors and other endocrine disorders can cause extreme height, thickened bones, and weird proportions. 7'8" individuals exist today, and some have skeletal changes that would look very strange if all you had were their bones. Translate that into prehistory. Every population of Homo sapiens on every continent, every time period would have had some small rate of these conditions. Most of those individuals would have died young. Some might have survived long enough to reach impressive size. If you found one of them in isolation with no other skeletons to compare against, you might be tempted to say new type of human. But disease doesn't make a species. Pathological gigantism doesn't rewrite the developmental program for a whole population. It tweaks hormone levels in a single individual. The genes underlying normal growth in that group can be absolutely bog-standard Homo sapiens. The way you tell the difference is, again, consistency. A disease case often comes with asymmetry. One limb thicker than the other, one side of the face expanded, joints showing signs of stress, vertebrae with compression fractures from supporting too much weight. A species-level trait shows up evenly across multiple individuals with clean, bilaterally symmetric anatomy and no extra signs of mechanical breakdown. So giant because of a tumor is firmly on the table, especially when you're dealing with a single skeleton or a single bone. The third explanation isn't about what the bones really were. It's about what they became after death. Bones do not fossilize politely. They get crushed, stretched, chemically altered, and then, worst of all, reconstructed by humans. This is where taphonomy and reconstruction bias come in. Minerals can infiltrate bone and expand it, making it look thicker and more massive than it was in life. Sediment pressure over thousands of years can warp a skull into a shape that never existed in any walking, breathing creature. Cracks can be filled in with plaster in whatever way seems most reasonable to the person doing the reconstruction. If your mental model going in is giant humans, you may unconsciously stretch a fragment a bit too far, fill a missing section in a bit too generously, or choose casts from large comparative specimens as your template. You don't have to fake anything. A small bias at each decision point can turn a big human into a giant in the final display. This is why modern labs obsess over documentation. CT scans before and after preparation. Digital reconstructions that show which parts are real bone and which are inferred. Measurements recorded at every stage. When that level of rigor is missing, and in older finds it often is, the line between a truly massive skeleton and an ordinary one that's been puffed up by geology and glue gets blurry. Layered on top of all this are the social explanations, hoaxes, and honest mistakes. Hoaxes are relatively rare in professional paleoanthropology, but they're not unheard of. The Piltdown Man scandal in England, where a human skull was deliberately combined with an orangutan jaw and presented as a missing link, poisoned the field for decades. Outside formal science, things get even messier. Local collectors, amateur diggers, or colonial-era explorers sometimes embellished stories, exaggerated measurements, or simply misremembered what they'd seen. None of this means every claim is fake. It means that over time, a chain of small distortions can turn a tall person into a giant, a big 4 into the thigh bone of an 8-foot man, a large animal bone into proof that humans once towered over us. The way these things get caught is almost boringly methodical. You take new measurements with standardized tools. You redate the bones with modern techniques. You look for saw marks where someone might have adjusted a specimen. You compare the supposed giant bones to big-bodied animals from the same region. Megafauna, primates, even large birds. And over, flashy claims quietly deflate when they're actually tested. But there's one non-sensational explanation that scientists take very seriously because we already see it in living people. The tall population scenario. You don't need a new species to get a group of humans who are on average much taller than their neighbors. You need a mix of genetics, nutrition, and local selective pressures. Think about the Niloic peoples in East Africa, or some populations in the Upper Paleolithic European record. Long legs, relatively slender builds, average heights that would stand out in many parts of the world today. Given the right environment, reliable high-quality food, low disease burden, maybe a cultural preference for tall mates, height can drift upward in a few thousand years. If you layer on selection pressures that reward size, maybe for wading in deeper coastal waters, maybe for carrying heavy loads over rough terrain, maybe for social dominance in small competitive groups. That trend can accelerate. On an island, this can get even more pronounced. Founder effects mean a small group of initial settlers can skew the genetic deck. If those founders happen to be on the taller side, and if nothing pushes height downward like chronic famine or extreme cold, you can end up with a population where 6-foot-plus males are pretty normal and 7-foot outliers occasionally appear. In bones, that looks impressive. In local memory, it becomes the era of the big people. You'd see ordinary modern human skulls and faces, normal limb proportions scaled up, standard dental patterns, just more of everything. You might even see subtle signatures in the DNA, variants associated with growth hormone regulation, bone density, or metabolism that are common in this island group and rare elsewhere. But taxonomically, you'd still call them Homo sapiens. From a scientific standpoint, this scenario ticks a lot of boxes. It explains tales of tall ancestors. It fits with known human biology. It doesn't require any invisible lineage splitting off in the dark. If the remains from our hypothetical island show modern cranial features, modern postcranial anatomy, no consistent archaic traits outside the range of known human variation, then tall island population will be the default conservative explanation. Notice what all these alternatives have in common. They don't kill the story, they just move it. Instead of a lost giant species, you get a tangled bone bed misread as one creature or a rare disease case frozen in time, or ordinary people who just happen to be tall living through extraordinary times. Each of those is still a real mystery you can investigate with measurement, dating, and genetics. And that's where we have to go next. If there really were tall populations on this island toward the end of the Ice Age, and if their bones are still somewhere in the ground, what can DNA actually tell us about who they were, and what? Can't it ever settle for us? To understand what genetics can tell us about a supposed island of giants, you have to start with a slightly depressing fact. DNA dies. It doesn't vanish all at once. It breaks. Long strands get chopped into shorter strands, those into fragments, those into chemical noise. Heat speeds this up. So does moisture. So do certain kinds of soil chemistry that chews up organic molecules like a slow-motion acid. The spectacular ancient DNA stories you hear, Neanderthal. Genomes, Denisovan genomes, mammoths, Ice Age wolves, almost all come from cold, dry, or otherwise friendly environments, caves that stayed cool year-round, permafrost that locked tissue in ice, bones buried in neutral, relatively inert sediments. Now, think about many real islands in the tropics and subtropics. High humidity, warm temperatures all year, biologically active soils full of microbes, roots, and burrowing animals. That is a murder scene for DNA, even if bones are preserved well. Enough for you to hold them in your hands, the genetic material inside may be nothing but scrambled fragments, too short and too damaged to read in any useful way. This is why for many coastal and island sites older than about 10,000 to 20,000 years, especially in warm climates, ancient DNA is the exception, not the rule. So if you hear someone say, "We tested the giant bones and got no DNA, therefore they must belong to a non-human species," you should immediately pause. Failed DNA on a hot, wet island could mean the bones are too old. The environmental conditions were too harsh. The collagen degraded beyond recovery. It does not automatically mean mysterious creature outside all known lineages. It often means physics and chemistry one. That's limitation number one. But genetics is sneaky. Even when direct bone DNA is gone, there are other ways to look for traces of who lived somewhere. One of the most exciting tools of the last 2 decades is environmental DNA, EDNA. Every organism sheds cells into its surroundings: hair, skin, feces, saliva, decaying tissue. In the right conditions, fragments of DNA from those cells get trapped in sediments, cave floors, lake beds, or even old hearths and mittens. With careful sampling and ultra-clean lab work, you can sometimes extract that sediment DNA and get a blurry snapshot of who was around. Horse, deer, mammoth, bison, spruce, pine, grasses, and sometimes Homo. We've already done this in places like Denisova Cave, in layers where no human bones were found at all. Sediment DNA told us Denisovans had been present. Later layers carried Neanderthal DNA. The dirt itself became a kind of ghost census. On an island with a supposed population of unusually tall humans, in theory, you could do something similar. Take cores from cave floors, lake margins, ancient shelters. Screen the sediments for mammal DNA. If you find human sequences, you compare them to known lineages. Modern humans, Neanderthals, Denisovans, other archaic groups. If the sequences match ordinary Homo sapiens, that doesn't settle whether they were tall or not. But it does say the hominins using this place were genetically part of our broader species. If the sequences show something else, branches of the family tree that sit between known groups or outside them, that would be explosive. But environmental DNA comes with traps. It's incredibly fragmentary. You may be piecing together a few dozen or a few hundred base pairs out of a genome that has 3 billion. Those short fragments are easier to misinterpret. A little bit of contamination from modern humans handling the sediment from surface water that carried in recent DNA from lab error can swamp the ancient signal. Sediments also move. Floods rework layers. Burrowing animals mix deposits. Roots drag DNA from one level to another. You might think you're sampling a layer from 18,000 years ago, but the DNA in it could be a cocktail of 18.8.080 years. So, a claim like sediment DNA proves unknown hominins lived here until exactly 12,000 years ago should make you want to see the stratigraphy, the controls, the replication, the contamination checks. Genetics can whisper hints from the dirt, but it rarely shouts on its own. There's another angle, though, and it doesn't require ancient DNA at all. It uses us. Modern populations, especially those whose ancestors have been rooted in a region for a long time, carry records of deep history inside their genomes. We've already used this to detect Denisovans. Long before anyone found a Denisovan tooth, geneticists noticed something odd in the DNA of present-day people from Melanesia, parts of Southeast Asia, and some indigenous Australians. There were chunks of genomic sequence, blocks of variants that didn't look like typical modern human variation. They also didn't match Neanderthals. They branched off earlier as if there had been another human group related but distinct that had interbred with the ancestors of these populations. Only later did physical remains from Denisovan Cave confirm that yes, there was a previously unknown human species whose DNA is now woven into modern people. If there really had been a long-lived, partially isolated population of tall humans on a specific island, there are a few ways that might leave signatures in modern genomes. You might see regions associated with growth, bone development, or metabolism showing unusual patterns of variation in people whose ancestry traces back to that island. You might see segments of DNA that are highly divergent from typical modern human sequences, but that appear at appreciable frequencies in local populations and nowhere else. You might find tiny echoes of an unknown archaic lineage. Short ancient-looking DNA fragments suggesting a mixture with a group that separated from other humans hundreds of thousands of years ago. These are the kinds of patterns that have already been used to infer ghost populations, archaic humans we haven't yet identified in the fossil record, but can see in the genomes of living Africans and Asians. But here's the catch. You can only see those ghosts if there's enough genetic material left from them in living people. And if you actually sample the right communities with enough resolution, if the island population went completely extinct without leaving descendants, their DNA dies with them. If their descendants were later swamped by waves of migration, farmers, sailors, colonizers, their genetic contribution might be diluted to such a low level that it disappears into background noise. If political, ethical, or logistical barriers mean local groups are undersampled or not sampled at all, you're staring at a map full of blank spots and pretending they're empty. So when scientists say, "We don't see evidence of a distinct archaic lineage in the genomes we've tested from this region," what they're really saying is, in the people we've looked at so far, we don't see clear, unambiguous traces. They're not saying therefore no such lineage ever existed. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when the evidence depends on who you're able to sequence, which parts of the genome you focus on, and what comparison data you have. On the flip side, genetics can fool you in the other direction. Contamination doesn't just haunt ancient bones and sediments. It can creep into modern sampling too. If your reference databases are skewed, overrepresenting some populations, barely sampling others, you might misclassify perfectly ordinary variation as mysterious. If your statistical models assume a simple tree of human evolution when the reality was a tangled web of interbreeding, you can misread complex but natural patterns as evidence for an exotic ghost species that isn't really there. That's why in this area, more than almost any other, Extraordinary claims require painfully careful work. So, what could actually tighten the picture for our hypothetical island of giants? A few things. First, more and better sampling of human remains from well-documented layers. Even if the DNA is badly damaged, improvements in sequencing, chemistry, and computational reconstruction keep pushing the threshold of what's possible. Fragments we can't read today might become legible in 20 years. Second, systematic environmental DNA surveys from multiple sites, caves, dunes, lakeshores, combined with really rigorous sediment, so we know which layers are genuinely from the time window we care about. Third, dense genomic sampling of living people with deep local ancestry done with full consent and benefit sharing using analytical methods that explicitly allow for complex mixture and ghost lineages. If there was an unknown group, their signature, however faint, might show up as unusual ancestry components or archaic-like tracts in those genomes. Fourth, better integration of genetics with everything else. Detailed measurements of any giant bones, high-resolution dating, isotopic analysis of diet and mobility. Genetics can say this person was biologically part of X lineage, but only archaeology and anthropology can say this is how they lived, this is what they ate, this is how tall they actually were. In the end, DNA is powerful, but it is not magic. It can reveal hidden relationships, expose imposters, and resurrect vanished populations in abstract form. It can't by itself tell you what it felt like to stand next to one of these people, to look up at a neighbor whose head brushed the cave roof, or to decide whether a story of giants is exaggeration, memory, or a little of both. For that, we have to put the genes back into bodies, the bodies back into landscapes, and the landscapes back into stories. And that's where the mystery gets sharp again. Because even if genetics someday tells us exactly who lived on that island 12,000 years ago, it might still leave us with a more unsettling question. Why did they vanish? That's the last piece of the puzzle we have to tackle. The mystery hangs around for a simple, annoying reason. We don't have enough good data, not because nobody cares, not because scientists are hiding anything, mostly because the universe and human institutions are very good at getting in the way. Start with the ground itself. If your island of giants is a real place, it's probably not a pristine, untouched open-air museum. It's a living landscape. Villages sit on the flattest land. Roads cut across old terraces. Resorts hug the best beaches. The caves that might hold the deepest history are sometimes the same caves used for burials, shrines, or storage. Right now, digging there isn't just a scientific question. It's a cultural, legal, and ethical one. Even where sites are known, they're rarely simple. Storms erode cliffs, exposing bones one year and burying them again the next. Sea level rise eats away at coastal shelves where people might have lived when the ocean was lower, submerging evidence under meters of water and sediment. If you want a neat, layered, undisturbed time capsule, the planet offers only a few. Most of the rest is a tangle. Then there's money. A full-scale research project on one island is expensive. You need boats or helicopters to reach remote coasts, electricity, refrigeration, and clean water for field labs, specialist teams, archaeologists, geologists, osteologists, dating experts, geneticists, permits, local staff, translators, community liaison. Every season you run costs 6 figures, sometimes 7. And you're competing with projects that promise big guaranteed returns. Neanderthal brain evolution, the first Americans, climate change, and past megadroughts. Funding committees are conservative. They're like safe bets. We want to spend $1 million to see if legends of giants point to an unknown island. Human is not a safe bet. It's a gamble, and most grants are designed specifically to avoid gambles. Add politics to the mix. Archaeological permits aren't handed out in a vacuum. They're wrapped in national pride, local identity, and often suspicion. If the remains in question are tied to indigenous histories, colonial encounters, or contested land claims, everything slows down. Sometimes that's good. Communities absolutely should have a say in who digs where and why. Sometimes, though, it means sites sit in a kind of legal and emotional stalemate. Everybody knows they matter, but nobody can agree on what to do with them. On top of that, there's the dark side of publicity. Once a place is labeled mysterious, people show up. Treasure hunters, relic traders, well-meaning enthusiasts who don't realize that every time they pry a bone out of a bank or a cave floor, they're tearing it out the layer that tells you how old it is and what it was buried with. Governments react by locking things down or by quietly pretending the site isn't important at all. just to keep it off the radar. Meanwhile, the clock is ticking, bones rot, caves collapse, coasts erode. So we end up in a familiar scientific limbo. We know just enough to suspect there's something interesting here, but not enough to say clearly what it is. And the trickle of new, high-quality evidence is painfully slow. In that vacuum, disagreements bloom. Some of those disagreements are healthy. They're about interpretation. Imagine you and I are looking at a partial skeleton from the island. We have a leg bone that's clearly robust and long compared to typical modern human averages, plus a pelvis. That's wide and heavy. You might say, these proportions suggest a distinct locally adapted population, maybe even another species. I might counter. Or they suggest a tall, well-fed subgroup of Homo sapiens living in a climate where big bodies do well. Look at variation today. There are pastoralist groups with astonishing average heights. We're using the same data, but we're plugging it into different mental models. Classification debates are like that. Where do you draw the line between a tall, unusual population of modern humans and a separate hominin species? Some paleoanthropologists want clear, consistent skeletal differences across multiple individuals and sites before they even begin to entertain a new species. Others are more willing to split, especially if the bones come from an isolated environment where rapid change is plausible. Then there are competing stories about how evolution works on islands. One camp emphasizes island gigantism and island dwarfism as strong forces. Given long enough, they say isolation and weird ecologies can turn average-sized animals into giants or dwarfs, including hominins. Another camp sees gene flow everywhere: boats, rafts, storm-driven crossings. They argue that complete isolation is rare and that most island populations were constantly trading genes with the mainland, which dampens extreme changes. They look at a tall skeleton and say that's gene flow from somewhere else, not homegrown giants. Underlying all of this are different standards of proof. Some researchers are comfortable building a provisional model on a few key finds, then testing it. Others won't even acknowledge a model until there are multiple skeletons, tightly dated layers, clear cultural associations, and independent confirmation from another site. Neither approach is wrong. They just lead to very different public messages. So, what would it actually take to move this from rumor and endless debate to something more like a resolved chapter in human history? It wouldn't be one spectacular bone or one viral photograph. It would be a program. First, systematic surveys. Walk the coastlines and uplands with a plan, not just a hunch. Use Lyre to peer through dense vegetation and pick out old shorelines, terraces, and cave mouths. Record every site with GPS, photos, and standardized forms so that the whole island slowly turns from blank space into a mapped archaeological landscape. Second, controlled excavations. Pick a handful of promising caves, shelters, and open-air sites. Excavate them slowly in small measured units. Screen all sediments. Bag and label everything. Maintain detailed notes on stratigraphy, where each layer starts and stops, how it changes across the site. That's unglamorous work, but it's how you avoid the nightmare of interesting bones with no context. Third, direct dating. Any candidate giant skeleton or fragment of one has to be dated as directly as possible. Radiocarbon on collagen, if there's enough, uranium series or ESR on tooth enamel, optically stimulated luminescence on the surrounding sediments to cross-check. No more it must be 12,000 years old because it came from a layer near a hearth we think is 12,000 years old. And we're pretty sure no one disturbed it too much. You want dates that stack. The bones, the ash, the sediments, all converging on the same time window with known uncertainties. Fourth, open data, measurements of bones, high-resolution scans, raw dating outputs, stratigraphic logs. If the only way to evaluate a claim is to trust a PDF summary or a conference talk, skepticism will never go away. But if anyone with the right training can download the data, reanalyze it, and look for errors, bad ideas will die faster, and good ideas will get stronger. Within a program like that, there's a minimum bar you'd want to clear before you could responsibly tell the world. Yes, large-bodied humans definitely lived on this island until about 12,000 years ago. At least multiple individuals, not a single tall outlier, but a cluster, men, women, maybe adolescents, all showing consistently above average stature and robust build documented with full measurements. secure context. Those individuals coming from well-described layers that are clearly older than, say, 10,000 years with no evidence of later intrusion, and with multiple independent dating methods agreeing within reasonable margins. Cultural association tools, hearths, food remains, and maybe structures. Or burial practices in the same layers. So we know these aren't random bones washed in by a flood, but members of a functioning community. Comparative analysis, clear published comparisons with known modern human variation from the region and beyond. If the island skeletons are taller, how much taller? Do their limb proportions match any known population, or do they fall outside the typical ranges? Only when all of those pieces line up can you begin to talk about survival 12,000 years ago with something approaching confidence. Notice what's not required. You don't need proof of a totally separate species. You don't need DNA. You don't need giant skulls as big as barrels or femurs twice the length of yours. You just need solid, repeatable evidence that a local human population on that island at that time was significantly larger bodied than what we'd expect by chance, and that they were really there at the moment the world was shifting out of the last ice age. Will we get that? Maybe. The next discovery might not look like a headline-grabbing colossus pulled out of a cliff. It might look like a carefully excavated burial in a small coastal cave, a skeleton lying in a shallow pit, knees drawn up, sprinkled with a little red ochre. The field team measures the bones and raises their eyebrows. This person is tall, very tall. The next year they find another and another. They date them, double-check, triple-check, and the numbers keep coming back. Around 12,000 years ago, right at the hinge point between the Pleistocene and the Holocene. Or the breakthrough could arrive quietly in a lab. Someone remembers old giant bones sitting in a museum drawer, this time with modern methods, and notices patterns nobody saw before. Someone runs a new kind of isotopic analysis and realizes these people had a diet or mobility pattern unlike any known group. Someone sequences a fragment of sediment DNA from an undisturbed cave layer and finds human signatures that don't quite fit the genetic profiles of later arrivals. Any one of those threads could pull the story taut. Why does it matter? Because this isn't really a story about big people. It's about how finely tuned our picture of the past can become. If we can show that a distinctive population of tall humans survived on one island into the dawn of the modern world, we learn something huge about resilience, isolation, and the diversity of ways to be human. If we can show they didn't, that the legends of giants are exaggerations built on ordinary variation and scattered bones, we learn something just as important about how stories grow around fragments of truth. Either way, the island stops being a blank canvas for whoever shouts the loudest and becomes what it actually is, a test of how carefully we can listen to the deep past with all our tools and still admit what we don't yet know. And that's the last thing we have to face in this journey, what it means to live with that uncertainty. So where does that leave us? On one side of the scale, we have things that are reasonably solid. We know islands can push evolution into strange corners. We've seen dwarf elephants, giant rats, and miniature humans like Homo floresiensis. We know that late surviving local populations can hang on in odd refuges long after their mainland relatives disappear. We know that oral traditions sometimes preserve faint echoes of real geological events, extinct animals, and encounters with other human groups. We also know that big bodies are not miraculous. Modern humans can be very tall. Whole populations can skew taller or more robust when diet, disease load, and climate line up just right. A handful of unusually long bones in a cave doesn't automatically mean new species or forgotten race of titans. It might just mean tall people lived there. On the other side of the scale, we have the gaps. The measurements we'd like to see aren't all published. The dates we'd want aren't all nailed down. Some key finds have fuzzy provenance. We don't know exactly which layer they came from or whether those layers have been disturbed. Legends of giants blur into colonial myths, folk stories, and modern conspiracy videos. Somewhere inside that tangle, there may be a kernel of truth, but the edges are frayed and smudged. So, we end up in this uncomfortable middle ground. There is enough to keep serious researchers interested. There is not yet enough to close the book. That tension between suggestive clues and rigorous proof is where deep history lives most of the time. It feels unsatisfying because our brains want neat answers. We want to know if the giants were real or not, full stop. But science, especially when it deals with fragments of bone in damp caves on shifting shorelines, rarely gives us full stops. It gives us probabilities. This is likely. This is plausible. This is possible, but we need much better evidence. If you want to think like an investigator instead of a fan of one particular outcome, there are a few questions you can always ask when you hear claims about island giants or any dramatic prehistoric story. First, provenance. Where did this bone, this tool, this photograph actually come from? Who found it? When was it recorded in a field notebook with coordinates and lay descriptions? Or was it pulled out of a cliff by a tourist and handed to a museum decades later? Objects without context are not useless, but they are severely limited. Strong claims balanced on weak provenance should make you cautious. Second, methods. How was it measured? How was it dated? Are we talking about carbon on the bone itself or an estimate based on a nearby shell? Was the analysis done once in a single lab or independently checked? Can other researchers get access to the raw measurements, the scan files, the actual specimen? Solid methods are boring to read about. They're also the difference between a story that collapses under scrutiny and a story that survives. Third, alternatives. What are the other ways to explain this evidence that don't require a lost human species? Could disease affect bone thickness? Could a small sample size exaggerate how unusual a population really was? Could later burials have sunk into older layers? Could a photo have been staged, miscaled, or misinterpreted? In real science, giant unknown hominin is not the first explanation you jump to. It's the last one you keep in reserve after you've tried everything else and nothing fits. That doesn't mean we should dismiss wild possibilities. It means we should earn them. When you look at the island mystery through that lens, the picture sharpens. We have intriguing bones, but not yet a robust series. We have dating that points toward the late Pleistocene and early Holocene, but not a rockollid cluster around 12,000 years ago for multiple individuals. We have local stories of large people, but those stories are layered with centuries of retelling. We have a strong evolutionary framework that says island. Gigantism in humans is possible. But we don't yet have the kind of airtight archaeological package that forces everyone to nod and say, yes, this happened here at this time. For now, the giants on this island sit in a liminal space. Not fantasy, not fact. A hypothesis waiting for the kind of careful fieldwork and open data that could move it firmly to one side of the line. Learning to sit with that uncertainty is hard, but it's also where the real wonder is, because when we admit what we don't know, the past stops being a fixed picture and becomes a landscape we're still exploring. Every new survey, every re-examination of an old bone, every radiocarbon date that comes back from a forgotten cave has the chance to tip the balance. Maybe 10 or 20 years from now, we'll be able to say with confidence, yes, a population of unusually large-bodied humans really did survive on this island into the dawn of the whole line. Or no, once we got good dates and good measurements, the supposed giants fell comfortably within normal human variation. Either way, we'll have traded rumors for understanding. If you enjoyed walking that tightrope between mystery and evidence tonight, stick around. This channel lives in that space where deep time, careful science, and human imagination all collide. If you haven't already, please tap like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss future episodes. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from. I love seeing how far these stories travel compared to our ancient ancestors.